Sanam, can you give us an overview of Iran's current situation? A lot has happened in the region over the past year, and many of these events have had or are having an impact on the Iranian regime. I think of the war in Gaza and against Hamas, the war in Lebanon and against Hezbollah, the end of Assad, just to name a few. Can you help us making sense of it all?
So, over the past 18 months since the war in Gaza began, the Israeli government has taken a new position vis-a-vis the Islamic Republic. The two countries have had a very long adversarial relationship where Iran has supported and positioned groups on Israel's border, like Hamas, like Hezbollah, has long supported the Assad regime in Syria. And what we've seen is an Israeli campaign, not just to diminish, but degrade, if not destroy, these Iran-backed groups. And this has effectively led to the collapse of Iran's forward defense strategy, which has created or which tried to create deterrence for Iran away from Iran's borders. So the collapse of this strategy has made Iran obviously look very weak. It has also seen two rounds of direct strikes between Israel and Iran over the past year of 2024. And it has really shown that Iran was perhaps a paper tiger, obviously, compared to Israel's quantitative military edge in the region. So this leaves Iran looking incredibly isolated and weak for the first time in a number of decades. And it leaves the leadership of the Islamic Republic really reflecting on its defense posture. And it could lead to new decisions, particularly with regards to Iran's nuclear program.
Well, but Sanam, what's happening internally? We know that some domestic events have also made it to the Western media coverage, so we know about this. I'm thinking of Masha Amini's killing, Raisi's death, Pezeshkian's election, and also, as you were mentioning, the race to acquire nuclear weapons.
Well, first of all, I should say clearly that Iran has yet to make a decision to pursue nuclear weapons. It does have an advanced nuclear program that remains out of IEA oversight for a number of years now. Since 2021, it has accelerated its levels of enrichment, using the acceleration as a pressure tactic vis-a-vis the West, because it is important to remember and remind your readers that in 2018, the U.S. under President Donald Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear agreement, which was a multilateral agreement between the U.S., Russia, China, and Europe and Iran to constrain Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. With that agreement no longer functioning, and because Iran is under the most serious sanctions, it is using accelerations in its nuclear program to push back against the West and try to pressure the West either to negotiate or to provide further sanctions relief. In the background, obviously, the sanctions pressure is also adding further challenges to the long mismanaged Iranian economy. And over the past number of years, we have seen Iranians protest in very serious ways over economic issues, but also in 2022, during the Women Life Freedom protests, over social repression as well. So we are effectively watching the Islamic Republic try to confront a series of interconnected challenges. There are the regional pressures. There is serious economic pressure where inflation is over 50%, unemployment is very high. Iran is economically isolated. And there is a wide degree of social unrest mounting inside the country. And of course, the political elite is conscious that these pressures could lead to new rounds of protests.
Well, let's have a sort of an historical perspective. I want to ask you, Sanam, how is the regime holding up after 45 years? I mean, every few years, someone predicts its downfall, and yet still there. And as we can see, it takes action that we struggle to fully understand. And for instance, think of Cecilia and her detention in recent days. I mean, can you help us navigate this?
Sure. So first of all, Cecilia Sala's detention is a tragic one, and she is one among so many people that are being caught up in Iranian domestic politics, but also in Iran's adversarial relationship with the West. And Iran has, for almost 2 decades now, been using people, particularly Westerners, but also Iranian dual nationals who have citizenship also abroad, as hostages and as pawns to extract concessions or to pressure Western countries. And very simplistically, Cecilia's case is another example of this strategy. And because Western governments have continued to engage with Iran and negotiate with Iran in order to rightfully obtain the release of their citizens, this is seen by a group of security-minded hardliners inside the country as a useful tool for the Islamic Republic. But let's go back to your original question and take a wider lens. The Islamic Republic certainly is an authoritarian state, and it has been led by its supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, who has been in power since 1989. He's quite aged at this point, 85 years old. And the system, despite being under serious sanctions and relatively isolated regionally and internationally, continues to survive. How does it do this? It has done so really by being coercive and repressive against its own people. It's done so by developing lifelines and relationships with other marginalized and isolated countries, including Russia. It has strengthened its ties with Russia, particularly since the war in Ukraine. It relies on its relationship with China to sell as much of its oil that it can, despite being under sanctions. And ultimately, the Islamic Republic, unlike other personalized authoritarian systems, is quite bureaucratized. It is an institutionally based authoritarian regime, and it has used institutions to coerce its population. And so, in absence of an organized opposition, which is very hard to build inside a repressive authoritarian system, last year, for example, the Islamic Republic executed over 900 people using executions to repress its own society and to create a cloud and culture of fear against protests and dissent. So without this organized opposition inside the country, it's very hard to see political change come in a revolutionary way, perhaps as we've just seen in Syria. What is likely to happen in Iran, and what most of us expect, is that change will come once Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, dies. Of course, it's hard to predict when that's going to happen. And that change won't necessarily lead to the regime change that most people inside Iran and also internationally are hoping for, but perhaps a change in the regime's composition, maybe even its posture. There is a very large and active Iranian diaspora as well. Iran is very successful at pushing its young population out of Iran. And what has happened is, of course, there's been increased activism. But Iranians, unfortunately, are not particularly united. They know what they don't want, which is the same thing that happened in 1979. They are not very clear on what they do want. And in absence of unity and cohesion and pluralistic cooperation, which is perhaps currently not in the cards for Iranians, the regime, continues to coerce and to survive effectively.
Well, Sanam, can you thank you first, and can you come back a bit and expand to what you were telling us about this sort of hostage diplomacy that Iran has been pushing in the last few years? Can you expand a bit to let us understand more what's happening right now? Thank you.
Yes, of course. I mean, this is a bit of a complex dynamic, and it's what I haven't touched on is a bit about the domestic politics among Iran's very competitive factional elite. Not everybody shares the same views, and in fact, you have factions that are very conservative and ideological, and socially very conservative and paranoid that outside forces, particularly the United States, but also Western states, would like to see regime change in Iran, or, of course, to change the regime, in a military way. So you have this group that is, particularly security-minded, and then you have other loyalists within the system that are maybe more pragmatic or more moderate. Sometimes they're referred to as reformists, who seek more openness and engagement with Western countries to improve Iran's economy and to break Iran out of isolation. And these competitive dynamics between these groups have seen the election of reformist presidents like Mohammad Khatami or President Rouhani. And today, in fact, in Iran, you have a moderate president, Pezeshkian, who was elected after the surprise death of the previous president, who was very conservative, Raisi. And so this competitive dynamic is important to understand, because politics keep lurching back and forth between this conservative ideology and this security-minded paranoia of conservatives, and then reformists that try to open and engage in order to improve the economic situation and give people within the country a bit of breathing room. Both groups, it's important to note, are loyal to the Islamic Republic.
Yeah.
They're not looking to change the system, but they have different policies. And it's against this competition that, of course, individuals, people like Cecilia, have been caught up and used by the system, particularly the judiciary and the IRGC intelligence organization, which is particularly paranoid, which is looking to protect its own interests, but is also looking to use the detention of foreign nationals to obtain concessions from Western governments. And there have been numerous examples in the past where foreigners have been held, for example, to exchange foreigners with Iranians held abroad. And I think for Cecilia's case, the assumption is that she is being unfortunately detained because Iranian-Swiss dual national Mohammad Abedini Najaf Abadi has also been detained in Italy and accused of exporting drone components that are illegal to Iran. So, the assumption is that there would be some sort of swap to release him for her. There's also been a pattern in the past where Iran has held particularly American-Iranian dual nationals, including Siamak Namazi, who was the longest held individual for over 8 years, for the release of Iranian assets abroad. And we saw exchanges of individuals for funds, most recently under the Biden administration, when Siamak and 3 or 4 other people were also released, but also during the Obama administration, when 5 dual nationals and nationals were released, again, for Iran's frozen assets. So this is unfortunately a very ugly strategy for Iran to pressure the international community, and using people in very malign and ugly ways.
Thank you, Sanam. So in terms of what you just said, and you mentioned it before, is the relationship with the West becoming increasingly complicated, or has it always been like this, and this time it's just our turn as Italy, and we are feeling the consequences in a more acute way?
I would say it's probably always been complicated.
Right.
And certainly in this case, unfortunately, Cecilia is being caught up in two dynamics: this internal factional struggle between hardliners and more pragmatic politicians. I would imagine that the Pezeshkian government is not pleased to see her detention, and in fact, her detention complicates their broader objectives of negotiating with European countries, with the United States, with the Trump administration that's coming in. Iran has had discussions with Europeans in November, also at the UN General Assembly meetings in September, and intends to have another round of negotiations in January. So no doubt Cecilia's detention will be an issue that, of course, animates the Italian population, rightly so, but more broadly speaks to the lack of respect for human rights across the Iranian spectrum. And this is an important issue to pressure Iranians about. But on the other hand, inside Iran, conservative hardline individuals have understood that this detention policy helps to gain leverage, perhaps weaken and damage pragmatists at the same time. And oftentimes, these dynamics play out without coordination between ministries inside Iran. So I suspect this is what's happening. And hopefully there will be some conclusion quickly, and she won't be held for too long, and some conclusion would have to be met. I think above all, if Europe and if the international community intends to have a broader negotiation with the Islamic Republic over its advanced nuclear program, over its support for Russia in the war in Ukraine, the issue of detentions and using individuals as hostages really has to be addressed. I'm a big believer that foreign ministers of Europe should, publicly call out the Islamic Republic for this behavior. Obviously, Iran is not the only country to detain journalists, but there is a systemic pattern that needs to be addressed, and it is an embarrassing strategy of leverage that is really shameful for a state to pursue. And the only way to stop it is, I think, to publicly stand in front of a camera in a unified manner and sanction and call out Iran for this kind of egregious behavior.
Thank you, Sanam Vakil, for giving us the context of what's happening, what's there in Iran, and what's happening on the back of this tragedy that we're all witnessing, and we're all hoping that it will end very, very soon with the release of Cecilia Sala, our beloved colleagues. So, thank you, Sanam, for helping us understand what's going on, and thank you, Francesco, and we'll speak soon.
Thank you, Sanam.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.